Beginnings are the best. It's pure potential. This could be great, and there's nothing so far that indicates otherwise. It's all just waiting there to be revealed. It's a time where anything can happen. I grab my idea book and I start thinking up and down and left and right. And before long, there are ideas coming from everywhere. They're random, off-tangent, disconnected and weird. I think up opposites and metaphors. I look up different languages and I jumble up the letters. They're little scribbles and thumbnails and visual notes that don't make any sense to anybody but me. Some of them are good ideas and they get me really excited. But most of them aren't. And at this stage, it doesn't matter. That's why I love thinking them up so much. In fact, many of them aren't my ideas at all. They're other people's ideas, and they've infiltrated my brain. They're from books I've known since I was a child, ones I've grown to love as an adult, and those that I've collected on all my travels. They're from the thousands of images I've dragged onto my desktop. They come from museums and folk art, bedspreads at market stalls in Mexico, and Scandinavian ceramics, like my most treasured plate by Bjorn Windblad. And there's not much I love more than researching my obsessions. I became so obsessed with Bjorn Windblad's work that I visited the German porcelain manufacturer where he worked for many years, Rosenthal. And through sheer luck, I found myself designing a series of plates for them in celebration of his work. And this is what I made. I was given the theme Chinese fairy tale, and they were simply asking for designs that gave that general look and feel. But it was important to me that the designs had real meaning. So I set about researching Chinese legends to find stories I could tell across the full range of plates and cups. And what I found was stories about the sun, about how long ago there were 10 suns and it was scorching the land. And so the prince went out and shot them down one by looking into the reflection in the water. But the last sun escaped into the cave and the land fell into darkness. And suddenly it was very cold and nobody knew what to do until the rooster stepped forward and he said he'd have a go. And so he crowed, "Cock-a-doodle-doo!" And so the sun rose up in the sky. And to say thank you, the prince gave the rooster his red crown. And so to this day, the rooster wakes the sun and wears a crown. The idea to choose a story about the sun rising was sparked by the fact that these are breakfast plates. But it also owed a lot to the fact that I'd moved from Australia to Germany. And this shot was taken in mid-April, mind you. I was craving the sun. Living in a different country heightens my senses and makes me see things differently and question who I am, what I do, who it's for, and what I care about. Though of course you don't have to move from one side of the world to experience that. All you need to do is set yourself new challenges and do things outside of your comfort zone. Moving to Berlin was a really spontaneous decision, and I only arrived with my suitcase. I didn't know if my visa would be approved, and all my art materials were back in Australia where they remain to this day. And so it was a really uncertain time when I started work on an exhibition called Are You My Home? And what appeared was this Yeti character who was striding across the ocean and uprooting trees, holding on tight to the few treasures he could take with him. And you know, he's having a really tough time because moving countries can be hard. and he's in need of a hug. And here he is trying to re-establish his life in the hard, rocky ground. These pieces are like a diary of that time for me, because they're ideas straight from my life. I like to take complex emotions that I'm feeling and try and interpret them in a simpler way. But I also like to draw on the simple things I see in everyday life. While I lived in Berlin, I travelled a lot, and one day I was in an airport and I saw a little boy on top of a pile of suitcases on a trolley that was being pushed by his dad, and he was engrossed in a book, and I thought, that must be a really good book. And so here in my idea book, you can see my idea for a really good book, and that turned into this. Can you imagine how hard it is to work on something with that as the title? But it makes sense, of course, because it's an ode to reading. And in it, Sozi, who's my alter ego, travels around the world while always reading her book. Here she is having a bath in the morning, leaving the house, and gradually moving from landscape to landscape, with everything slowly becoming more unexpected. And all the while, a bunch of other characters travel alongside her, all heading in the same direction. She goes through forests, across a mountainous alligator, and even on a roller coaster. And the whole time, she doesn't put her book down. She travels so far, she ends up all the way home, where she falls asleep and all the characters throughout the book fly through her window and gather on her bed to have their chance to read the book. And everything from the book is based on somewhere I've been or something I've seen. Here's my dog, Mr. Tom, running in a blur through the snow. A bizarre fountain that we walked past every day. The bold colours and shapes of Berlin's subway stations and buildings, especially the ones that haven't been rebuilt and have holes in them. But most of all, it was about my love of books and the huge pile of books that I collected while I was living in Berlin. I'd gone from arriving with a suitcase to 8 years later leaving with a container. And just like Sozi, who travelled the world with her nose in the book, I worked on this book in Berlin for a couple of months back in Australia, and then here in Portland when I arrived last year. And by the time I was finished, I barely remembered the move. And the key thing here is that these ideas are made up of lots of different kind of ideas. They're ideas from other people and cultures, from research, life, travel, and change, all coming together to form one big idea. So, once I've thought about what I'm doing from every possible angle and collected all these ideas, I've got to give them some time to stew. And this is when I go for a walk with my dog or have a shower. And sometimes when I'm trying to solve an idea, I'll have about 5 showers a day. It's the time to let my brain make connections and unconsciously piece all my ideas together into something new. It's not the time to look at Instagram or do any more research or talk about it or force anything to happen any faster. It's the time to go to bed. And then it's time to take my initial visual notes and gradually meld them into ideas that make more sense and refine them into something that works and tidy them up until they're ready to go. And this right here is the point where it all comes unstuck for me, because I love this idea right now, and I love it most when it's rough. They look perfect to me because I can still imagine how great they're going to look when they're done. They're still vibrant and alive. And yet every step along the way, the more refined the sketch gets and the closer it gets to being finished, the more uncomfortable I become. When I start inking my ideas or vectoring them or whatever I'm going to do to finish that idea, I suddenly lose all hope. He may look cute, but I hate him. It's like all the life has been throttled out of him. I've had to choose one final line, one finished shape, and all that's left is what I'm capable of. I realise this idea is not as wonderful as I thought, or at least I don't have the ability to do it justice. And this is when I start to procrastinate. You might procrastinate at some other point. For some people, it's right at the beginning. But whenever it is, deep down, it's about anxiety, about the fact that you're probably not the genius who can finish things effortlessly. I'm teaching illustration at the PNCA at the moment, and it's something I talk to my students about all the time. We go from playing, from splashing ink around and experimenting. We do short exercises like this. No pencil lines, no pressure, and incredibly loose and fun results. This is the back of the paper looking at the ink that's soaked through. But finishing ideas is not as fun as this. Instead of playing, nearly everybody gets precious and tightens up, and it's a constant struggle to relax and enjoy the finish. For me, it's about getting to that point. This is what my inking looks like. I have to get so far that I stop worrying as much about what one tiny element of it looks like, but instead inking en masse and preparing to compile it all later. And while I'm doing it, I get lost in a whole other world. I listen to podcasts and I distract myself so I can loosen up. By this point, I have my warm dog asleep on my lap, and I'm so comfortable that I don't actually want to stop anymore. In fact, I'm enjoying it so much that I'll ink everything, every letter in the book, every single letter. And if you can get to that point, the point where you're just working away happily, then you're in the position to open yourself up to ideas that you hadn't expected. Things you hadn't planned for at all, but that change your idea for the better. My husband Steve and I spent 15 hours a day for 3 weeks painting this hotel room in Copenhagen. Animals fill the walls and sleep throughout the changing seasons. I designed the custom carpet, and my mother handmade a quilt and the curtains for the room. It was a serious labour of love. And so, when a huge, white, shiny hotel room bed was brought in, it looked like a UFO had landed in the forest. It looked more out of place than anyone could have ever imagined. Painting it wouldn't even camouflage it. I was so upset that I said I was going to come back in the middle of the night, chop the bed up with an axe, and the hotel guests could use it for campfire and they could camp in the room. And that was it. That was the new idea. We built a tent in the middle of the room over a comfortable futon, and it turned out that that mistake made the best idea possible. It became the tent room at the hotel. And even though it was one of the smallest rooms and it was on street level, people would specifically request it just so they could camp out for the night. For another project, we had these life-size props made with the idea of being able to set up worlds for hundreds of different lookbook images. The concept was to project different graphics onto them and end up with a library of shapes that we could collage into different worlds that were floating around in an unreal-looking galaxy. So this is one of the images that we made out of these elements. Each of the worlds was for a different product area. But I kept thinking about the fact that all the shots that we'd taken of these props had these great shadows that we hadn't envisaged, and the way the projections dripped over the paper. And that by rigidly sticking to the worlds that we'd planned, that we were missing some opportunities. And so I took these shots and I started playing, and I put them together to create these dripping galaxies that were the result of the projection process, but actually gave more of a feeling of the pinball space galaxy that we've been aiming for all along. And a big part of making these images was collaboration. The collaboration between Steve and I. He'd made most of the designs that we were projecting onto these shapes, and we worked together to art direct the shots. But it was also a collaboration with the client, who was open and involved in seeing these ideas change throughout the process. There are many ways of collaborating, and the surrealist exquisite corpse concept is a linear, direct way to see your ideas change. You pass your work from person to person, and the evolution is revealed at the end. We've played with that process a lot over the years. In 2000, together with a group of friends, we began a collective called Rinsen based on this idea of play and invited designers from all over the world to join in our RMX projects. At that stage, sending print-ready files around the world via the internet was still a little unwieldy, so we set a rule that all the work had to be in vectors. And everyone had to work to a theme. So this theme was bend your knees. You can see the little comment that says fold here next to his knees. And this is an artist from Germany. And then we would send that file to the next person. And that person would remix it and rework it. And in this case, this Swiss artist literally dissected it. So each artist only gets to see the piece that they're handed. So when the next artist put the car back together again, it was an idea without any prior reference. He didn't know it had been a car. And we found that when people played with what was in front of them, the results were most exciting. So rather than bringing their own ego or style to the piece, they simply played and experimented. A crucial part of making collaborations work is setting rules. In the case of RMX, it's themes, deadlines, size, and medium. If you have something to push against, it forces you to think laterally and do something you wouldn't normally do. For another version of the RMX project, I took it into the handmade realm. Most of the people involved didn't have any experience with sewing. So not only was I asking them to do something they weren't comfortable with, I was asking them to send it off and see it destroyed. So what happened was I made 20 blank stuffed toys. And this is one I remixed from the beginning. He's called Spätzle because of the German pasta dish. And he took a long time. And then I had to send him off. And I sent him to Friends With You, and they did this to him. And then to Shinola, who transformed him like this. And unlike the digital remixes, you don't get to keep anything. So it really was a massive sacrifice of your initial idea. But in return, you got to see where it might go. You cannot be at all precious to participate in this process. There was nothing like seeing Craig spend hundreds and hundreds of hours cross-stitching and then seeing it return like this. The ladies at the post office were enjoying the process as much as me, and I'd open the packages up in front of them. So when I sent this guy off, the entire post office gasped and actually took it quite personally. So I didn't feel like I could return there until I fixed him up. And so I put a light in his chest, just like E.T., which ironically meant I couldn't post him internationally because of the batteries. Right, so the fact is, no matter what the idea is or where it came from, what matters most of all is that you actually do it. Ideas are like dreams. No one else cares about them as much as you. You have to make them real before they matter. And that process of getting from the dreaming to the doing, from the pencil to the ink, or however the project's going to be finished, to that point where I'm carried away by the process, is an eternal problem for me, even when I've got a warm dog to keep me in my chair. I want to tell you about the time that I got stuck in that limbo for about 5 years. I wanted to make a picture book, and I'd made all the finished sketches, but I just couldn't get any further. The longer it sat there waiting for me, the bigger and the harder the idea felt. It was like a huge, immovable weight above my shoulders. I had so many other ideas and jobs and projects, and I just worked on them instead. But as I did, my picture book idea got older and more distant. I spent more time worrying about whether it was the best idea I could do, rather than realising that all the books I was comparing it to were done by people who kept working on their idea, rather than just thinking or talking about it. Eventually, I realised I wasn't going to get anywhere while I had my expectations set so high. I had to be kinder to myself. And instead of thinking I was making a masterpiece, I just had to aim for done. Most of all, I could see I was in danger of repeating something that had been happening to me my whole life. When I was 7, I started my first picture book that I didn't finish. I expected it to turn out better than it seemed like it was going to, and those penciled pages stayed pinned to my notice board all the way through school, and I finally threw them away on the day I left home to go to university. How could I be repeating this all those years later? So, I started. And this time I didn't talk about it first. Once I'm well underway into the process, I can talk about it. But in that phase where I'm vulnerable and I don't want anything that anyone else says to me to derail me, I gave myself a deadline. But it was also so I had time to experiment. Without enough time, I'll always do the thing I know I can do, and it won't give me enough time to develop and improve. But with all the time in the world, nothing will ever happen. I stopped looking at the whole idea that was overwhelming me, and I broke it into tiny pieces that were achievable. Doing one 10-minute task is easier, and the more of those tasks that I did, the closer I got to the end. Plus, I love lists. Of course, there were times that I took stock of my progress, and I was convinced the whole thing was a mistake. The more I worked on it, the more I saw what had to be fixed. But I realised that ditching it and choosing another idea wouldn't make it any easier. I couldn't see all the flaws in the other idea because I hadn't started working on it yet. Better to stick at the idea at hand no matter how much of a headache it's giving you. And of course I could see that if I didn't believe in my own idea enough to see it through to the end, it would never mean anything to anyone else. You can't see what's hiding in all those scraps of paper stuffed in the back of my drawers. Even when I really wanted to give up, I kept going because I finally realised I will never be satisfied by what I make, ever. And that is part of the creative process. Why would I keep going if there wasn't a surprise, if there wasn't more to learn, if I wasn't going to get better? It's what makes us make things. What's the point of only doing things I'm good at? And eventually, after lots and lots of work, I finally finished that book. And it was about something I'd thought a lot about, my ideas. And it stars Sozi and her hundreds and thousands of ideas. They swim around in her head, all slippery and slimy. But she has so many that it comes time that she just can't move for her ideas. She's finally got to do them. So she sets off to get started, excited by the pure potential. But it's harder than she thinks. It's not turning out the way she expects. And she crumples up so much paper that it turns into a gigantic paper beast that scares away her very last idea. Fortunately, she meets an idea book, and together they recapture all her ideas so they're safe. But not just ideas, other things too. And she focuses on one idea and decides that's the one she wants to make. And it's an idea for a book. And she works hard and through her doubts, and she finally reaches the end. But then her idea book opens up to give her a hug and catches her between its pages too. And she ends up living in her own idea book and reading her book to her friends. But of course, that was her idea. It's the end of the book. She's finished her book, and I finished mine. I finally made it to the end. Thank you.